This is episode 16 of season 5 of Babylon 5 and All My Dreams Torn Asunder. Sheridan sleeps fitfully and realises Delenn is next to him. She keeps vigil with a candle in the living room despite his suggestion that she will need all her strength for what's ahead. Finally he gets up and showers and sits heavily on the bed, and she joins him as they both steel themselves for what is to come. Londo and Veer try to get access to the council chambers, but Zack bars their way, despite Londo being a member of the advisory council. It is apparent they won't be getting in until called for, despite their justifiable anguish at effectively being tried in absentia. Delenn explains that what they have to say is very painful for her at a personal level, yet lives, ships and cargoes have been lost, hundreds of millions of credits over 6 months. The pain caused cannot be measured. She then names the Centauri Republic as being behind the attacks, to the shock of the council members. Sheridan then reaffirms their commitment to stand with the League Worlds to support their course of action, no matter how heavily that promise now sits. In his quarters, the candle burns out. Franklin hands a dossier to Londo, then returns to the chamber to give his evidence steadily. He explains that each energy weapon used by the various races leaves a fingerprint in the way it bleaches the skin and damages the eyes in the moments before death. Each focusing crystal inherits certain characteristics of local materials, and so each is unique to the race that built the energy weapon concerned. So the technology and its biological effects can be used to identify the race that built the weapon, and the race in this case was the Centauri. Further, he notes that the Centauri tend to use energy weapons with explosive effect rather than cutting into a hole in a slicing action. Post-mortems confirm damage done to bodies in keeping with such attacks. Garibaldi is next, again visiting Londo before delivering his evidence to council. He confirms both the method of attack on the ship from the debris and the tactics conforming to Centauri training exercises, although the latter is subjective. He then presents the button from his assault on the Drazi homeworld, and notes that once Londo was excluded from strategy meetings, there were no further leaks leading to compromised missions. He also notes that only the one Centauri ship has been attacked, an aging freighter due to be scrapped, and no bodies were found. It now seems very likely this was intended as a false flag operation to ensure the Centauri appear to have been targeted by the attacks. Jakar comes to Londo's quarters next, not to provide evidence, but to tell Londo that whilst he did not provide evidence, he did see, when generally his guest and bodyguard on Centauri Prime, that something was amiss in the information space on military activities. Jakar infers from this that Londo knew something was happening, even if he did not know what exactly, but Londo snaps at him, yet also acknowledges his respecting his privacy. Finally he asks why he is there, and Jakar says they are ready to see him now. It's apparent that he knows how badly this is going. That being said, when he arrives in the chamber, he says he was at first insulted by the accusations, and then did the only thing he could with them, and he tears up a dossier, flinging the pieces in the air and condemning the contents as a joke. He points out that Centauri weapons have been sold to other races, that the Narn had access to current Centauri hardware from the abandonment of Narn by the Centauri. So all the evidence could have been invented to point blame at the Centauri. As he is about to leave, Delenn stops him and says there is another piece of evidence they wanted him to see at the same time as everyone else. Lanier enters the room with the data crystal of the attack he recorded in the last episode. The moments leading to the attack are then projected for all to see, as is the attack itself as the shocked room looks on. Londo has nothing more to say until he speaks to his government, at which point Sheridan, Delenn and Jakar stand, and Sheridan declares a blockade on the Centauri, their effective isolation from the rest of the ISA until they accept what they have done, apologise and make reparations for it. The Centauri Republic now stands alone. Londo paces his quarters, waiting for word from home, which is slow to arrive, and when it does, the best the Regent's representative can come up with is that the Narn created an elaborate ruse using salvaged ship hulls and ferried Lanier around, showing him exactly what they wanted him to see. As Londo believes Lanier to be fully honourable, this of course made him the perfect messenger to implicate the Centauri. Londo then delivers a series of pronouncements in council despite his and Veer's disbelief at the Regent's conclusions. He plays the Centauri as the victims, announces the Republic's withdrawal from the Alliance, and their rejection of the legitimacy of the blockade. Further, every Centauri transport will be escorted by a top-of-the-line Centauri warship, and any act of aggression on Centauri shipping will be deemed an act of war. He then says he will be leaving the station immediately, but Sheridan says he can't just walk away, and if he does, he may never be allowed back. He still goes, telling Veer to get him off the station rapidly, but telling him to stay to maintain a presence, so that he can be their spokesperson when the truth comes out. We see a Centauri shuttle arriving shortly after. Delenn arrives to Jakar's quarters. Basically, he's going to Centauri Prime to guard Londo again, because he might be their only hope of resolving this, assuming he isn't in on it. He just hasn't mentioned this to Londo yet, but he's booked the seat next to him. Delenn agrees that it's very unlikely Londo would agree to random attacks on civilian shipping. As Londo said to Veer earlier, it's one thing to hit civilians whilst the state of war is in place, but it's not something the Centauri would ever do, acting as if they were common pirates outside of wartime. While she acknowledges that this idea of protecting Londo is not without merit, she notes that should war break out, he would be a Narn, alone on the Centauri Prime, with no way for the Alliance to reach him. He knows. So he passes her some revised chapters of the Book of Jakar to replace earlier chapters written when he was less at peace, and asks her to get them to Narn if the need arises. She compliments him on his writing, and he says he has all the thanks he will ever need from her just by looking into her eyes. So they part fondly, if sadly. Sheridan is hunting for Garibaldi and sends Zack to find him, and he quickly realises he's drunk, as he's unable to catch the oranges Zack tosses to him. He then lashes out when Zack tells him he's picked a crappy time to fall off the wagon. Yet Zack won't turn him in yet, Garibaldi saying he just needs a little more time to get his head together. So Zack will get him some oxy pills to get him over his hangover and back on his feet. Unfortunately, shortly after that, Sheridan outlines a plan to Michael that will require him to act as the linchpin for the blockades to work. Sheridan believes that the Centauri would take on other League races' ships, but not if they're backed by White Stars. But they have to know where to put the White Stars, which requires Garibaldi to gather the intelligence and then pass it to Sheridan in time for him to deploy the White Stars. Delenn is even trying to get the Grey Council to intercede, but he's not holding his breath. Sheridan sees this as the only way to try and avoid a shooting war breaking out, and as Zack notes, Garibaldi is an alcoholic, so we can all see how tenuous this decision is, but of course Sheridan doesn't know that. Londo and Jakar arrive onto Centauri Prime as warships stream overhead and guards are placed everywhere. Jakar notes that this is a scene he has seen before, and now Londo knows what it feels like to be on the other end. As Jakar spars with the Centauri meeting them, Londo is barred from seeing the Regent and encouraged to go to his quarters until he is available. Further, whilst Jakar's presence will be tolerated for Londo's sake, if he's seen alone he will be shot on sight. Not the warmest of welcomes for either of them. In space, a White Star tries to contact Garibaldi, who is once again out cold. It resolves to go it alone as the Centauri fleet with a heavy transport jump into real space blockaded by Drazi Sunhawks. Just as the White Star jumps in, the Centauri Vorchans open fire, and the massed Sunhawks respond in kind. Michael has failed at the first hurdle. Zack wakes Sheridan and Delenn, Sheridan telling Delenn that it's begun. Veer is also stonewalled by the Regent's minister as he urgently tries to reach Londo to tell him what's going on. Franklin then arrives to get Veer to new quarters as quietly as possible because Londo's quarters will undoubtedly become the centre of unwanted attention very shortly. They make it a reasonable distance before being accosted by several Prekiri, who, when Franklin notes that Veer has diplomatic immunity, point out ironically that they're not diplomats. Franklin sees the way it's going and sidles up to one saying it's really malaria they want before he throws the first punch and the second, Veer knocking the third down before they exit the area together. In the council chambers the situation is similarly heated, as the White Star fleet has not yet been told to engage the Centauri. The near steps between Delenn and the Prekiri ambassador as Garibaldi both dodges blame and is less than clear on who fired first. Regardless, Sheridan is pressed, and as the scene descends into chaos he shouts above it all, furious, damning them for asking for the White Stars, and damning himself for having made the promise to them in the first place. Damning them all, because instead of providing peace and cooperation, they're going to provide war instead. With that declaration, the Regent's minister arrives to arrest Jakar and imprison him as an active alliance member, whilst communication with Babylon 5 has been cut off. Londo tries to intercede, but the order has come in from the regent. Londo demands that if Jakar is imprisoned, he will have to be imprisoned with him, believing the minister will not dare jail his prime minister. He's wrong, of course, and Londo tells Jakar to shut up before he said a word as the cell door closes. Londo just doesn't know, quite literally, what's going on anymore, as moonlight filters through the bars in the cell's window. On the station, Delenn considers the flame once more as Sheridan joins her. She tells him it represents all life, every life, as every flame is as unique as every life which, once gone, can never be replaced by one quite like it again. And so many flames are going out that night, she wonders how they will continue to see. In making a cup of tea, it occurs to me that there is a piece missing from this episode, and that piece is Lockley. She is notable only in her absence, because Earth is a member of the Alliance, and I would expect to see her representing Earth on the Council, because of course Earth as part of the Alliance should also be enforcing the blockade. Now, perhaps I'm missing something and Sheridan acts on Earth's behalf as part of the Alliance, but I doubt that's actually the case. In the past, that voting role always fell to the station commander, and yet this is the ISA Council rather than the Babylon 5 Advisory Council, so I'm not sure if that logic still holds. It just seems to me that Earth is the only major part of the ISA that doesn't seem to have a role, which is decidedly puzzling. Very similar to their level of participation in the Shadow War when you think about it. So that curiosity aside, I didn't remember a huge amount about this episode, although I did think Jakar was going to stick with Londo, which of course he did, for reasons that were entirely logical, but with an outcome that was also entirely predictable, apart perhaps for Londo ending up in jail with him. Londo just doesn't seem to appreciate how much he's been sidelined, which is interesting because he normally has quite a good line into the royal court, even at a distance. And Jakar did right in calling him out for having had some inkling that something was going on, because he did indeed already know that. Yet as Jakar also knows, his government had effectively closed its doors to him on the topic. And now the Centauri Republic is once again at war, this time with everyone, it seems. And this is where the Alliance will be put under pressure like never before, newly formed as it is. I don't really see that Sheridan has any choice but to do what he said he'd do. The White Star Fleet is really the major strategic card that the Alliance holds, but it's a finite resource. It's not really clear from this episode whether the Minbari would join in militarily, and arguably they'd outgun the Centauri pretty happily, because it was noted once by Londo that even at the height of the Republic, they knew better than just to poke the Minbari. So presumably there will be an argument to say the member worlds primarily defend their own space, with only the White Stars as the backup. That helps the Centauri, of course, at least up to a point. There is, of course, a glaring plot hole here, in the sense that Vorchans can open their own jump points. So with so many of them running escort duty, going through the local jump gate, which is bound to be guarded, is basically a red rag to a bull. They could just open a jump point anywhere in system for the transport, then carry on in normal space to avoid interception. Not convenient if you want to make a point, of course, and the Centauri probably do want to make the point, that they can come in the front door if they damn well choose to. Not tactically sound though when the other side knows you're likely to be coming and is prepared. I like the initial setup with the individual tranches of information being passed to Londo first, then the evidence being given until the final reveal of the footage. Jakar and Londo were at their best here, I think. Jakar observing Londo being utterly on the back foot, yet resisting the urge to sink his teeth into him. Pitying him a little perhaps, being swept along by events without control. Compare this Londo with the one that declared Jakar persona non grata as the Centauri conquered the Narn. He's now the one making grandiose threats in the face of the Centauri being subjugated by all the other races. The wheel turns. I also really like Jakar's interaction with Delenn as he commits to watching Londo again. They both know what the outcome might be, but respect each other enough not to question it. I didn't really get the point of the Veer Franklin scene other than the diplomatic community gag. It was entertaining. It just showed they were still looking out for him, I guess. The Sheridan and Delenn dynamic was a little more evident in this episode, which I think it was important to show, because as Sheridan says to her early doors, it was going to be a difficult time for them both, perhaps more so than they anticipated, because of course Garibaldi utterly fails to stop the shooting war breaking out almost immediately. Presumably anyone looking into that is going to be able to figure out where the ball was dropped pretty rapidly, although you do wonder why Garibaldi was the only point of contact for the whole thing. Again, that doesn't seem to make a huge amount of sense as single points of failure go. The war room's still available, right? The Zack and Garibaldi interaction is both painful and illuminating. Watching Garibaldi trying to catch the orange is just pitiful, and even worse is his attempt to deflect Zack's truth-telling by suggesting he forgave him plenty. Garibaldi is in a position where mistakes have very high consequences. A single button was all he lucked out on during his mission to the Drazi homeworld. That's how thin a thread he's working with, which I suppose is the point in highlighting this problem. That Zack now knows but is covering up is also an interesting decision, but how far will Zack really allow it to go before his own position is at risk off the back of that? There's certainly an interesting comparison to be drawn here between Garibaldi once being Franklin's conscience for not prosecuting him. Then Franklin stepped away to deal with the Stims issue. The question is, will Garibaldi do the same here, having acknowledged the issue to Zack? Or will Zack feel as Garibaldi once did, that there may come a point where he has to press the button himself? There's also something niggling me about Sheridan's angry outburst against the ambassadors in the council chambers when they demand that he brings the White Stars in. I don't know if I'm remembering it from my watching it previously or from an episode of something else, but it was just that I was almost getting deja vu off it. The editing was very clever there, though, jumping from one angle to another to emphasise his fury at the position he's been boxed into. Never start a fight, but always finish one, eh? So yes, I think this was certainly as close to Season 3 or Season 4 levels of intensity and coherence as we've seen in Season 5. It's just a shame it's taken such a long time for us to reach this point. I was reminded on listening to the Grey 17 podcast that JMS said he lost his notes on this season at one point, which may explain to a degree why it seems to stutter a little, but in my own headcanon, I think I chalk it up primarily to the compression that happened with Season 4. So we have 6 episodes remaining to wrap up this season, folks, and we clearly do have some significant Centauri questions to wrap up, assuming someone remembers where they put the Prime Minister, of course. See you for the next one.